I have in my hand the first issue of Christianity magazine that was published in 1984 that I received in the mail. And on the inside page, it has cut out of it where you were to cut out and subscribe, which I did immediately when I received the paper. And I had been preaching for 6 years at the time when I received this. And in my other hand, I have the last issue of Christianity magazine that was published in December of 1999. And I'm happy to tell you that I have every issue that belongs between these two, between the first and the last. And so I have the privilege this afternoon to speak to the 5 men who were the editors of this publication. And thank you for being here today and for sharing your time with us and with others who will be listening. So I think the place to start is just to ask how Christianity magazine came to be, whose idea it was, and how it all got started.
It wasn't mine.
No. No, mine. No. It was mine, obviously, and I had actually back in the 70s, in '74, I had proposed to Yater establishing Vanguard, and thought of that name just as a kind of alternate paper, and Vanguard had kind of run its course. So I was in I think Fairview Lectures with Dee, and at the airport, or on the way to the airport, I told Dee, I said, well, Dee, I've been thinking about getting a paper started that would be maybe readable for a broader audience, not just a preacher paper. And so I guess that was the second lectures we've been together in. You know, I discovered this very charismatic character in Dee, and so we discussed it some, and Dee came up with a number of ideas. I think the one-page format was Dee's idea, and then Dee can react to that meeting where it kind of began. We then immediately, of course, thought of Brent because the design capabilities that he could bring to it. And that's where it began. I mean, from there, we went to recruiting Paul Earnhardt, and recruited Paul because, you know, I, for years, thought, you know, he was the most underdeveloped talent that I'd ever met, and so he was a harder sell. And Sewell, I guess, was the last person that we approached, and Sewell came reluctantly as well. When I thought about Sewell, I thought about Bill probably first. His brother, I knew Bill better, and I had actually worked with Bill on a 77th Street publication called Perspective. But Sewell was so talented, and honestly, there are other factors fed into all of this, and Dee can talk about it too. You know, Sewell and Bill both had such a strong influence in Alabama and the South, and I appreciated his work so much. In Vanguard, he'd done a lot of good writing. So that's kind of the sequence of how it got together, but it started in that meeting with Dee. Dee, why don't you reflect on that?
We had finished up the Fairview Lectures when Ed came to me and said, how are you going to the airport? And I told him, he said, well, I want you to ride with me. I want to talk with you about something. And so he sprung on me the idea of the magazine, and both of us agreed quickly that neither one of us had a sufficient amount of time to give all of our time to editing the magazine. And that's when we, I don't know which of us came up with the idea, but we came up with the idea of having more than one editor. And we first thought the two of us, and then that evolved into the others, and we began to talk about that. As Ed pointed out, Brent was our first choice because he's absolutely a genius at graphics and that kind of thing. And he did wonderful things to help the paper get started, and we knew we needed something that had some real class to it. The things that we talked about that made the paper different had to do basically with people in the pew. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, Ed was the first one to say, we need a paper for the people in the pew. And that was the idea. We were not trying to fill any void or trying to have any competition with anybody, but rather to fill a void. And we talked about preachers who would be amenable to that kind of an idea, and Paul's name came up, and Ed and I both agreed. The first time I ever heard Paul Earnhardt preach, it was so good I cried. I'm telling you the truth. And we just thought that he would be stellar. And then, of course, we didn't know a better man than Sewell Hall, so we began to recruit. Sewell came on board really slowly. In fact, we listed him an editor when he wasn't an editor, is what happened. But that's how the paper began. We came up with this idea for one article on one page to finish it. Because we live in a society, we thought, that is fast-paced and people don't have time to take a lot of time, but you could read that if you were on the bus going to work or at the breakfast table or other places where you are. So that was the concept. I don't think of anything else, Ed, that I would add to that.
Would you say?
You remember that I was not told I was going to be an editor when I agreed to write 2 articles a month.
I guess that is right. I'd forgotten that.
I remember
I
that you
didn't
only
forget.
became an editor when you were told you were going to be an editor.
And aren't you glad we drug you screaming and kicking to stardom?
In fact,
I haven't got fun.
in fact, Paul told me one time, said, if you and Ed don't leave me alone, I don't know what I'm doing.
Would you say that the goal of the publication remained the same for the whole time, and do you feel like the goal was accomplished?
I think it remained the same. The goal, I mean, because we were all of one mind about it. And I don't know that I'm aware, some of the other fellows may sense that any evolution took place. Now, we did get rid of those drawings that we started with, which was clever, but people started making comments about it. But otherwise, I mean, I felt that. And there was a sense, we were very different people, as becomes evident when we're together. But there was a common sense of purpose, our approach to the kingdom of God and so forth. So it made us a rather maybe unlikely combination, but one that worked really well.
One thing, I think it retained that interest to the common Christian.
Yes.
I found a lot of places I went that the preacher didn't take the paper, but members of the congregation did and would mention articles that had been written. And that's fine. That was the original plan. And we were glad it did appeal to those who might not have been preacher types, if I may say it.
Did we not get letters from people in out-of-the-way places where churches were tiny
Oh,
and expressed appreciation?
And those were the places where it was appreciated most. Sometimes the more isolated congregations where people just didn't have a lot of opportunity to know preachers much, it seemed to have some effect.
I think it stayed exactly the same, and I don't think that if you read through the paper that it changed at all, save with my single transgression, which we no doubt can discuss later on. But we intended to not be a brotherhood publication or to be involved in brotherhood doings, but rather we're a magazine to try to teach people. And I think it was extraordinarily faithful to that.
We made a decision when we started the paper, too, that I always thought was very instrumental in keeping the paper on focus all the time. The first decision we made each year when we met in Jacksonville was whether or not we would continue the paper for another year. We never were just married to it from the standpoint of the philosophy of the paper. We were interested in the people that it was reaching. And when we felt like that it was not reaching the people, then we would have stopped. We never made provisions. All of us have sons. We never made a provision to pass it on to anybody. The 5 editors were the ones who would begin the paper and end the paper. And that was the philosophy we had in mind from the beginning. It never did change. I never saw any time that we lost the focus. There were times when we discussed things, avenues that we might take or procedures that we might make, but we never changed it except as it benefited the people. It's all about the people is the way we felt about it.
Did any of you have any experience beforehand in literary publications? And I know Brother Ed did.
I had none at
Just
all.
church bulletins about it.
That was it.
I had written a column for Searching the Scriptures for several years called Insight, and that was the only. I also wrote for a Texas publication. It was called the Texas Bible Banner, and I was an associate editor for that for a little while.
Brother Tamp asked for our church bulletin and republished, with my permission, a lot of the things that were in our bulletin, and then I wrote a good bit for Vanguard, and those would be the main things. I did a paper in England that I mailed out, I think, every month to brethren in that area. So that is the extent of my experience.
Were you already doing a layout for other things?
Yes, I published with All Boldness a well-paid paper for some while through the church I was working with, and then later went to a subscription type paper with that. So I'd had some experience with that.
Now, for the getting started part, I heard y'all mention that you did a mass mailing of this first one. A lot of people have the issue that David has, where there's that cutout section. I could not find a mint copy, if you would, of the first one that went out. I guess everybody agreed to subscribe after that first sent out, or what's the story behind how that happened?
Well, another kind of secret to how Christianity Magazine began and succeeded was it basically was financed in the beginning by a small foundation that my father had left, and that was kind of critical in our getting the magazine off and operating it. And yes, we mailed out 15,000 copies of the first issue, and began with about 6,500 subscriptions. And so and that's how it began. As those of you that have been associated with papers know, it's very hard to financially survive as a paper under any circumstances. So we never did break even, I think. But
So can you tell us a little about the ebb and flow of the subscriptions through the years?
you know, my brother-in-law, who's been dead for several years, was really the one who did most of that. I don't have a good sense of that. It probably was largest in its first 5 years. However, it depended slightly on how much we neglected it. And if we got busy and worked at it, we would build it back up. And so I think it probably stayed at 4,000 to 5,000 throughout most of its existence.
We found out too that our subscription list is really big if you put the people on there that intended to resubscribe, that just never got around to it. And we had a lot of that kind of thing. And the paper was saved by a lot of people, which meant when it ran out, they still had a lot of copies to go back and read, and they kept it. So I think that probably hurt us a little bit on subscription lists.
One thing about it, none of us are promoters. That's,
No.
we just didn't promote. We
Except
didn't
for
push.
Paul. Except for Paul.
That was the personality.
The front man. That's what we need, the front man.
I think we would all agree that we could not possibly have made this paper go if it had not been for the Hartages, for Bob Hartage in Maryland, Ed's sister in Jacksonville, and Harold Dowdy.
Harold Dowdy.
They worked tirelessly, took care of all the business part of it, all the subscription lists, everything was done, and none of us could have done that. It
Exactly.
certainly was a much better organized just because of the things they did. It was a real work of love.
Well, as editors of the paper, what impact did it have on your life, your local work, your preaching at other places? Or did it?
Well, I got a lot of good preaching material from other people. And writing was not my love. I think somebody said, I felt about it like one fellow said about a woman preacher, like a dog walking on his hind legs. Didn't do it very well, but wonder he did it at all. So, I think of all the editors when the magazine ceased publication, I was the only one that didn't grieve too much about it. But our interaction with each other was really significant. And I think we all missed that. It was rather a remarkable experience. So that, and interaction with people who wrote. Editing was something else I had not planned to do. In fact, the truth is I didn't edit a single issue until Ed started his book on Oral Roberts, and he took a sabbatical. And here I was sitting here, and the other three guys were going to have to take it all, and they looked at me, and I decided, well, I'd edit one issue. One issue. I'll edit one issue. Well, they never. I got one, and they never let me out of the rotation after that. But I learned a great deal. But I won't tell you that writing still, I'm a very verbal individual, and writing is important to make you think, and this is what I guess I didn't like, to organize your thought, to make the transitions meaningful, and it was a great help to me. And so it was beneficial in every way in my thinking.
I know I was invited to meetings in a lot of places that I never would have gone. They thought they were getting Dee Bowman, and they found out they weren't. At any rate, it was a good experience to get acquainted with brethren in a lot of places that I never would have known otherwise, I think.
Really.
It was to say that it wasn't hard though, it was hard. Because all of us did two articles each month until it was our time to edit, and then of course we had all of those articles to edit, and everybody that sent in an article was always and forever from 2 to 4 paragraphs too long to fit on the front page. So we had to do a lot of that kind of thing. In my own personal instance, I found out very soon that there's this strange connection between inspiration and deadlines. And when it comes time for the deadline, all of a sudden you come up with something that you can put in. Not always as good as you'd like, but it did come around regularly. I think everybody would agree with that.
Was there anybody else that was roped into being an editor, as you put it, Paul? Anybody ever tried to? I mean, y'all ever tried to? I know y'all didn't get anybody. Did y'all ever try to get some?
No,
No, I did not.
no, this was it. I mean, once we got Earnhardt's picture in there and made him famous, and we didn't want to try to stretch it too far. No, 5 was enough. I mean, that was, it would have been unwieldy to get much beyond that.
So each of you wrote 2 articles a month, and then you rotated on editing the theme articles at the network, which meant you solicited those articles. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then received them and edited them, got them to the person who was going to do the layout.
And then we had some additional articles in most every issue over and beyond the theme articles. And sometimes people sent those in, sometimes we actually solicited them. That might not fit the theme exactly, but something that would be important to keep the paper balanced as much as possible. Sometimes we had to come up with something of our own from selected, you know.
Some people on the newspaper had pseudonyms and wrote articles under a pseudonym. I'm not going to tell you who it was.
When I was working in radio, I used to have I had some disc jockeys that were always sick on the weekends. And so when the weekend would come around, I usually got a call about once a month from one of them that was sick. And so I'd have to go fill in for him. And rather than tell them, I didn't want anybody to know who I was. So I changed my name to Herman Hilliard. And I would do the radio program under the pseudonym of Herman Hilliard. When I didn't get enough articles, I ran some articles under the name of Herman Hilliard. So they're in the paper. Smart aleck.
Blew your cover after
He blew my cover after all these years.
Actually, I wrote a couple of articles for the Gospel Guardian years ago with a pseudonym before I was sure which side I was going to come down.
I'll tell you what was interesting though. You probably could not find 5 more diverse personalities, and yet I don't know about these guys, but I never knew 5 people that I loved any more than I do these guys. 4 of them. Would you quit? They're all just special men, and I sat with them and talked with them, and we endured some things together that melded us together in a way that we never would have had otherwise. And I never saw these men when I thought they were out of line, when they ever tried to hurt anybody, or when they weren't interested in the cause of the Lord. Excuse me.
I always thought we were just alike.
What are your favorite memories from it? I didn't get to grow up reading the magazine. I just found it whenever I broke into Paul's office in Louisville, Kentucky, and started scanning through. And I think I saw that y'all did a cruise one time, Christianity Magazine.
It was a trip. It wasn't a cruise to the Bible.
What was that like? How'd that go?
That was a wonderful trip. Of course, Farrell Jenkins was the one who led us on the trip, and Ed was not able to go because he was in
That's the
India.
reason it's wonderful? No, that's.
I was going to say, if everybody thought that was their favorite thing.
That was a great experience.
It was.
Farrell planned a very fine trip. We were able to go both to Greece and to Israel, and it was an experience that I'll never forget. And being with these other brethren was certainly a part of making it what it was.
But I expect that most of us would agree that probably our favorite times was every 4th of July. We would meet for a week in Jacksonville, Florida, and we had a meeting at the South Jacksonville Church, and we'd meet and discuss the magazine, and our families came, and those of us with any ability played golf, and others did other things.
Yeah, I wore a golf cap down there one time. Ed accused me of being a hypocrite.
Well, we always we invited Paul and Sewell that we'd like for them to come with us and play one day, but we were not sure we could get through in a day.
So before you began publishing the paper, you knew each other, but it sounds like you're saying to us that the publication of the magazine and the interaction that you had with each other resulted in the developing of your relationship and esteem and love for each other.
Well, they didn't know me all that well. I met Ed when he was worshiping at 77th Street in Birmingham, and he was coming to the meeting. I was in a meeting there, and he told me about every sermon, said I can make 2 or 3 sermons out of that. And he was coming in late every night besides. Anyway, and Dee I met when I was down in Texas preaching, and so I just came into this situation without a long-standing relationship, but I'll tell you, it cemented itself very quickly, and we just sort of fit together.
I'd only met Brent a time or two, and I'm not sure I really had met Dee until there was some discussion at least going on in the paper. And
But I had not met Paul before.
but very quickly, as has been said, we came to appreciate each other very deeply. And I would certainly say also that those get-togethers, in which sometime our families came as well, and even our children, I think, valued that relationship with the children of the other editors and with the editors themselves very, very highly. It was a really, and hearing one another preach and singing together and all those things at South Jacksonville was a really high point in each year.
I hated to give that up now.
Yeah, and Dee's point about those occasions, we never intended to start an institution or something that was going to go on. It was a yearly matter of deciding, should we continue to do this for another year? And so those meetings were kind of, that was our main business each year. Decide, are we still doing something that we think is useful? And are we doing something that we feel like we should keep doing? I mean, as you guys have tried to know, 17 years as an editor is a long time, and you get tired.
We did too, I think, something that doesn't appear rather obvious on the surface. And that is that the magazine treated, so far as I know, every major issue in some way or the other. It was not treated polemically, but it was treated skillfully and in a concise way. We finally, I think, treated every issue that I could think of that was, controverted.
I actually went through the issues preceding, I don't remember which year, but something had been said about a positive approach that did not condemn anything. And I intentionally went through the issues to see what things we might have neglected. And the only thing I found was that we had not had anything directly on premillennialism. And so I made certain that in the next issue that I edited, we had an article on premillennialism.
Well, to round out this first segment of our discussion, what would you say was the hardest part of publishing the magazine?
Looking at me.
Getting Paul to do what he's supposed to do.
I'd asked that question be stricken from about who was most difficult to get his issues in on time. And I confessed, I was probably the man. In fact, I was probably the slowest sometimes. to get
No, you weren't, Paul. I
This is a revelation to me.
Well, see, all the material came to me, and as late as it was, I was always the last one because I knew how long I had. So, honest confession.
That's mighty kind of you.
I'll take that off of it.
We did have difficulty getting the issues out on time.
On time.
For various reasons, and no one person was to be held guilty of that. But that was one of the things that was a problem, getting the issues out on time, especially with five of us involved and all the things that we were involved with.
Well, I don't know how Ed did his. I mean, he was in India part of the time we were doing this and had to communicate with his secretary at Auburn and all kinds of things to get the thing done. It was tough on everybody's, but especially these fellows.
Well, the earliest articles I sent in was before I knew anything about a computer, and getting those articles down to about 750 words, typing them and then counting the words and then going back and trying to get rid of so many and then trying to see whether you'd gotten rid of that many or not. That was a problem. But I really feel that as I said, as I believe you said, it was your idea. It was not mine. But I thought that the one-page articles were a significant feature of the paper and probably improved the writing.
I think there's no question about that because people had to trim the fat off. They couldn't just send it in fluffy. It had to be trimmed. It was pretty concise.
And in a few instances, we were privileged to trim the fat.
Well, there were times when I was really glad it was too long, because it gave me a good excuse to just about rewrite the thing.
Yeah.
Because there were some that, well, it just even in my eyes, as unskilled as I might have been, it was just difficult. But there were some people you did not edit. Older preachers
Yeah.
who had written a lot, you always sent it back to them to do with it what they will when you told them that it's just longer than it needs to be. And I had several times people say, I've cut it till it's bleeding. I can't take any more out. And I'd have to say, but we have to take it out. If we don't, the print's going to be so small, they're going to have a microscope to read it. Whatever. But anyway, that was a difficult thing for me in editing. But the writing was better because of it. Every adjective, I don't care how beautiful, every phrase, how wonderful, if it didn't carry weight, had to go.
That's true.
It had to be cut out. So that the writing was much improved on that account. Mine was, I know.
Yeah, you can learn. I mean, that's the first lesson I teach a graduate student. When I assigned them a 5-page book review and they turned me in a 10-page book review, I don't read it. I give it back and they'll say, well, you know, just a huge book, you just can't review this in 5 pages. I said, no, you can't write a 5-page review, or you can't write a 10-page review in 5 pages. You can just write a 5-page review. So we have to learn to put our thoughts in the limits that we have. I tell you on the late thing, I was going to comment for those of you who are involved or been involved in papers. Getting paper out on time. I'm absolutely sure if you put a graph on subscriptions and getting your paper out on time, that they would go together. That when you don't do it on time, that it hurts your subscriptions.
Last question as we transition into some directed stuff. A few of the articles have been republished in book format. What all has done that, or any future plans for more articles to be republished in that format that y'all know of? Or?
Well, I think there's some plans to do Brent's Psalms things in a book also, and rightfully so. Wonderful material that he has. So I think, don't you plan to do that?
Yes, I'm hoping to some, it'll be a little different format, but I am hoping to do some things from the work on the Psalms material. And I may impose upon Ed to do some of his rear views.
Yeah, I'd like to do my rear views as soon as I fulfill all my other contracts.
Are there any, I mean, just for those who maybe don't know, your Hallmarks book, is that all articles from the Christianity magazine?
All but just one or two. And I might just say that Gary Fisher selected those and published them. I didn't really do that.
And D, or That's Life, is that all from That's Life column?
All of those columns, except for a couple in the last book, were right out of the magazine. And they were just bits and pieces that I took, that Brent and I got together and decided which ones would fit. And that's how we did it.
Well, Brent, these next few questions are for you, but anybody's welcome to add in as we go through. How difficult was it getting the magazine ready from month to month, since you were the one that kind of had that? And for those who didn't know the technology back then, what kind of did y'all have to use for that back then?
Well, it was a grind for sure. And I usually ended up working pretty late at night trying to get all of that done at different times. And of course, the deadline of getting it out, if we decided to go somewhere as a family, I had to figure out how I was going to get that finished into the printer before we got away. So that was always a difficult thing to get done. But I enjoyed working with it, of course. It was a great thing to do. And of course, part of the problem was that everything had to be done and pasted up into place in order to go. We started on this, there were no computers. Ed probably had one at the university, but I'm sure none of the rest of us did when we started this. So it was a lot of work involved in it.
Any advice for today's layout editors with the changes in technology or any of that?
I think everybody's pretty well adapted to the new technology, and it really is a blessing to work with electronic files and that sort of thing. It's made it much more easier.
I really think, too, that Brent's creativity had a lot to do with the early success of the paper. It was different enough, and yet it was good-looking enough that it really was appealing to people.
What were some of the things that influenced your decisions on design?
Well, I just always had an interest in it, and I never had any training in it. I just kind of observed what was done in different media and sort of adapted what looked like to me would work. So I just always had an interest in that. I got the typesetting equipment fairly early, all the way back to of course, the IBM Selectric typewriter was the first thing back in the middle to late 60s. And then from that, IBM developed a compositor, they called it, which was the IBM Selectric style or method of doing that, but it had much more of a typesetting feel to it and so forth. So I had an interest in it and developed from that.
What's the story behind the sketches?
The sketches were done by a fellow in Lubbock where I was living, and we all liked them until we found a few people who didn't. At least I think we did. The initial reaction was pretty good.
What was it that somebody compared Ed's sketch to?
I don't know, but it would have to have been an improvement, wouldn't it?
Robert Redford?
I knew we shouldn't have left.
Yeah, that's right. You played the straight man there.
Any typos, embarrassing moments from typos that you remember that stood out to you?
Well, the one thing that I do remember, Paul probably remembers, I was always pretty good at spelling. And I took one of his articles, and the word was Pharisaic or Pharisaism or something like that, and I misspelled it all the way through. I changed his correct spelling to the spelling that I thought was correct and got it wrong. That one I'll never live down, at least with Paul. But I don't remember a whole lot more. I do think I ended up correcting more errors than I did making errors, at least in that regard.
Oh, absolutely.
Did you ever ask Ed for a bigger budget?
I did, but it didn't work out that way.
Well, we all got paid probably what we
Oh,
wanted.
yeah, that's right.
The and then some column. I don't guess I have any other layout questions. But the and then some column had a wide variety of quotations from other authors. From what I've been able to tell, the reading that I've been able to do. What was your process for composing that column? What was on your reading list?
Well, I just read everything I could get my hands on that I had time to read, and I always read, when I was doing that, I always read with a view to something that might work, you know, that would help in that regard. So there wasn't anything in particular that I remember, but I was always aware of that. I'm sure these other fellows were aware of things. I know some of the things that Ed wrote for his reviews column were just things that happened, you know, and he's real good at picking up on things that happen and making a good point out of it. So I was kind of that way in regard to those things.
Brother D, I'm going to talk to you a little. You want to tell us about That's Life? Did you do a column like that in a church bulletin, or what was the idea behind that? Or
No, the first That's Life was done for the magazine. I never had done that before. I always liked small bits and pieces so that you could get a little thought out of some little thing. And I like numerically placed things because I think it gives a little bit of definition. And so I just began to do that, just to do the magazine. I took it to Brent first and told him what I kind of had in mind, and I called it, I forgot what I did.
You called it
Life, just Life. And Brent came up with the idea of calling it That's Life. And so I began to do it, and it really just kind of evolved out of the kind of way my mediocre thinking goes. I just like the simple things. And again, I can't emphasize too strongly that all of us did our columns with a view in mind to the people, to making something that people could take, even if it was just a little germ that would initiate some kind of new thought that they had, or even if it would be some little motivational thing that would put into being some course of life that they would not have had otherwise, maybe. And we were all interested in that sort of thing. And I think all of our columns behind all of our columns was an effort to try to help people understand the Word of God. We never got very far from the Bible. We just wanted to do things for the people with the Bible.
and those columns have been reprinted into 2 books.
There are 2 books, yes, sir, and they've been well received by people. It's not on the New York Times bestseller list or anything like that, but people have been mighty sweet to read it.
And have most of the articles, most of the pages been reprinted in those books?
I'm not sure that I'd say most of them. All of that came out of there, but I took the ones that I thought were the better ones. And again, I leaned on my buddy here, Brent, to help me figure those out.
Your first article in the paper was latch on to the...
No, I didn't. I don't have anything to do with that article.
I know you've been criticized for that, so you want to talk about that?
Well, I know that we've been criticized some, and of course Ed was the first editor, and it coincided with what positive Christianity is all about. The problem I found with people's criticism of the article is very simple, and that is I used a kind of a little gimmick that you use sometimes in journalism, where you start out with a thing and make a bookend at the other end of it. I started the article, if people would listen to look at it carefully, I started the article by saying that sin is inherently negative and the gospel is inherently positive. I went through and tried to show that what we need to do is accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative and latch on to the affirmative. And before I was through 3 months after that article, I wish that I had never heard of Johnny Mercer, who wrote the song Accentuate the Positive. But I still have no problem with the article. If I were asked to do it again, I think I would do it precisely the same way. In the middle of the article, it says I'm not advocating rah-rah religion or feel-good religion. It was an effort to try to accentuate the gospel and eliminate sin.
You printed several things in the journal, in the publication from your journal. Can you tell us a little about your journaling efforts? And
Well,
do you still do that?
yes, sir, I do. In fact, I wrote in my journal this morning before I came. I've done a journal for, I guess, right at 40 years. And there's an absolute history of Christianity Magazine in that journal. All of the ups and downs and all of the things that we discussed and that sort of thing. There never was any adversity in it, but it was honest, and it did treat criticisms with honesty, integrity. I've just always enjoyed journals. I've always written with a pen and ink, for one thing. I like fountain pens, and I like to write things down. So I don't know really how I got started doing that, to tell you the truth, but I've always kept a journal.
That's a daily discipline for you.
Yes, it is.
Boy, you ought to see his journal. I mean, it is something. It'd be a good historical document, and it's pretty too. And he writes pretty.
He does.
Yeah.
Dr. Johnson of the 21st century.
It is really impressive, those guns that he keeps.
Well, it's been a labor, a joyful thing. I'll tell you something I found about it too. When you're upset with somebody, if you write down why you're upset, it diminishes the intensity of your dislike right quick like. It makes you feel kind of foolish for feeling like you do sometimes. My wife has been wonderful through all of these kinds of things, the controversies, and she used to write letters to people and then turn around and tear them up. and I know why she does that. It's kind of a purgative. It kind of helps you to get rid of the junk, and the journal does that for me. It's hard to say mad at somebody when you're writing their name down. So.
And I've heard you personally say you've prayed for people who've been involved in controversy with.
I haven't. That's been very difficult for me because I am by nature fairly high-tempered. But I, like these other guys, we've all had to learn to say these guys' names that it's opposed us. We say their names out loud to God in prayer. I think they deserve that. They're brethren. And we don't want to hurt anybody, but that doesn't argue we're going to sacrifice any conviction. It just argues that we believe in prayer for people that we don't agree with.
In your last article, your final frontline column, here's a little quotation. History will research our efforts and report our contributions or the lack of such. It's 10 years past, maybe too early to allow history to say anything. What do you think history is saying?
Well, I think that it is probably too early, because I don't, Ed could probably answer that question better than could I. I do think that what I said there is absolutely true, that I think for one thing, and we have outlived what kind of criticisms that we had with the paper. I think it's proven to be something that helped us during that period of time when we had kind of lost sight of where we were going, and we forgot the people. We got so involved in brotherhood politics that we forgot the people. So I do feel that it will one day be seen as filling a niche, and I think the void that we tried to fill at the very beginning was filled. Now, I will not tell you that we never made any mistakes. Some of my stuff I'd like to redo, and I'm not sure that some of the things that we called mistakes will not be historically very helpful to people. So I feel like it's doing what it was supposed to do. I don't think it's some big glowing kind of historical document that people are going to say, oh, look at that Christianity magazine and those guys. Listen, we were 5 guys that are trying to serve our time. That's all.
And anybody who reads it honestly and seriously understands there was no ulterior motive on anybody's part.
No, sir.
No politics, just loving the Lord and wanting other people to love Him.
That's exactly right. You've done it better than I did.
And we thought that others would understand that too.
Yeah,
And
good point.
it came as quite a jolt when it was not seen that way. That is, to me. I thought they just didn't understand, you know, and I felt as though that maybe we could help them understand. But that did not occur, and so one thing we did, we kept all that out of the magazine.
Almost.
You know. You were not writing in response.
I was not, that's correct, and we'll get to that later. But let me make a comment about these. These summarize the paper, I think, well. I believe that it came along at a period when there was some danger of just a factiousness that was destructive, and it was driving many congregations into what I have called a hyper-congregationalism, separatism, just withdrawing, saying, I don't want anything to do with any paper or any other kind of association. And I felt that we were providing a more unifying, a kind of presentation of what it is that we're trying to be and what we're trying to do, and that served a useful purpose. It was not a purpose that was universally agreed on, and consequently we received some criticism, for which I take criticism quite easily, actually. But I thought it was quite useful for us to be taking it rather than for somebody else to be taking it, because we were people that, you know, were not going to be destroyed by it or anything else. So that I thought we served as a useful buffer and unifying force in a time that had the potential to become quite factious and divisive and to drive people into very private enclaves that were not helpful.
I do think, too, that history will show that while we received the criticism, we absorbed it. We did not procreate it. We didn't make it bigger than it was. None of us, to my knowledge, ever took any of this stuff to the pulpit. It was left with the paper, and that's all. We never took it to the pulpit. We didn't call people's names and that kind of thing.
Well, we're to the next person, and we're going to have to break in the middle of this, but we'll go ahead and get started and just be aware that he's going to get a signal in a bit.
Okay.
10 years after it's all happened, you've already started to mention it. So what are your thoughts about the controversial 16-part series, The Bounds of Christian Unity, everything surrounding that?
The only article that I would have, that I'd characterize as controversial was the Homer Haley article. And that was somewhat out of character for the paper. I'm not sure that it should have been that. My recollection is that I sent that to all of you guys before it was published, and that's not to say that anybody else would have done it, but nobody objected to my doing it. I felt at that point that was a kind of a critical statement about the factiousness that we needed to avoid. The series on fellowship was something actually that I preached for a good while and that I thought a lot about, just in terms of fellowship. It was obviously applicable to the situation. Those articles are basically historical and just describe the way in which the movement has reacted to differences of belief. Now, my Romans 14 allusions, which is what's been picked up on, I probably should have left out. However, if you're asking me the question, you still believe that? I still believe exactly that. That's the way I exegete Romans 14, contrary to some present scholars. But they were not. It was not central to the series of articles at all. The series of articles were about. I believe our movement basically divides in two ways over hermeneutical dissonance, when people come to the point that they are no longer reading the scriptures and interpreting the scriptures in the same way, and over generational changes, in which over a period of time people no longer behave themselves the same way. Now that's what those articles said, and they are more or less just statements of fact. I think obviously that's a question that has needed to be discussed, has been discussed. In recent years, I've noted there are a lot more people who kind of agree with my interpretation of Romans 14. But those articles, I think, they serve a purpose, and they were okay. No, I wouldn't take any of that back.
Have I read those correctly, that the thrust of the articles was how we make fellowship decisions?
Absolutely.
And not how we ought to do it, but how we do it.
How we have done it. That's correct. And in fact, that ends up with probably how we ought to do it, in the sense that there is no other way. I mean, in my book, The Church is Christ in the 20th Century, I make the point that if you're a part of a movement that says, we believe every person has a right to read the scriptures and determine what they say, and we are bound to do what we believe the scriptures teach, you live in a wild democracy. We always have. And people have always disagreed. Their disagreements were much more on the surface in the 1950s on non-institutional issues. There were lots of disagreements. I don't like them. I would like for it to be otherwise, but that is the way it is. And so, if you're engaged in conversation with a progressive out here, what he will say about that is, well, your principle won't work. You can't do that. I don't believe that's true. I believe the principle does work, but it doesn't work in the sense that it means everybody arrives at the same conviction about every passage of Scripture at the given moment. So that, I might need to go back and read those articles and be sure I said exactly what I mean, but in so much as they expressed that. And they were basically historical, and basically a rehashing of historical material that I'd written before.
Yeah, in your new book, so I reread it in preparation for this. You showed how there were people that said the same things prior to you ever writing about various different venues. So.
Yes, that's right.
Ed, you've written in some of your other books about the Churches of Christ that there's a concept called editor bishops. How did that affect your role with this magazine, and do you think the concept's fading?
Well, I don't think it affected our concept of who we were in our magazine at all, that we didn't feel that. But we are in an ununified movement. We are often held together in quite loose ways by personalities and by preachers who go different places, by institutions like Florida College. And so we did play, I think, a significant role along with other editors, because papers were in the 1970s more influential than papers are today. You know, there was a generation, particularly after the institutional division, in which certain personalities were extremely important, extremely widely known. People like Homer Haley and Jim Cope and Frank Bucket, and who, even when we came along, I mean, I preached in an awful lot of the non-institutional conservative churches, because there were not probably but 250 or 300 in the country, and there were not many people preaching. Now, there are so many more, and so many more preachers. And so there are periods when I think personalities and papers are particularly influential in giving a sense of unity and continuity in people's lives. We're actually in a period now when, as I'm sure these younger men, you guys who are wrestling with papers at this point, recognize that you know, you have good congregations and big congregations with good teaching programs who are saying we're going to do our own work and we don't care what any paper believes or what anybody else is doing. We're just going to take care of our own business, which is once again what I've called hyper-congregationalism. That's not really biblical either, because in the Bible they were concerned about what other people were doing in other places. But yes, we go through periods when personalities are extremely important and kind of giving us definition. You know, we remember back in the days when if there was a meeting in a conservative church, people within 50 miles would come because they needed that association and contact. And that's we're in a different age now. But we certainly never had any sense of aspiring to be leaders or anything of that sort.
Your columns are often in touch with what was going on in the Christians and denominationalism, or I'm not sure the phrases you might use for that, but you once predicted Catholics and Protestants would be united. What are your thoughts about that prediction? Do you think that there are any others that you knew that you did that have come true or might still come true that you think of?
I take the Pat Robertson escape clause on my predictions. Well, I don't know, Coulter. I mean,
I wasn't trying to catch you off guard.
No, you didn't catch me off guard. I just, you know, that's one of those 30-minute questions. American evangelicalism is evolving, you know, so rapidly today toward a more ecumenical and synergistic position. I mean, my prediction of Protestantism and Catholicism uniting may be a bit far-fetched, or take another 100 years or so. But as people lose their distinctiveness of belief, they are drawn to people who have similar kind of mindsets to themselves. Well, as the Roman Catholic Church has come to the right in the last 50 years, and evangelicalism has gone to the left, there are lots of common identities there. If you don't have beliefs that keep you from unifying with other people, then those kinds of unions are entirely plausible. And I like the Pope a lot of the time because of the conservative stances he takes. So if people ever lose their sense of distinctiveness, that I am different because I believe these things about the scriptures, then like-minded people are driven together.
Brother Earhart.
Oh.
I want to talk to you a little about your column, Mining the Scriptures.
Yeah.
The first series you did in that column was on the Sermon on the Mount. How did you come to choose that, or were you happen to be preaching a series on it at the time? Or?
No, I had to have something. And that all started some years before, when I picked up a book by Carl F.H. Henry on Christian personal ethics. And he's got a considerable section on the Sermon on the Mount. And he took a view that was a bit different than what I was accustomed to from my young days, when the contrast between the law and the gospel was supposed to be seen in those opposing ideas in the fifth chapter, and it kind of caught me. And I believe it was Rod Amonette that told the brethren up at Thayer Street in Akron that I could lead singing, which was absolutely not true. But I compounded that blunder by being pressed to say I would do it in the lectures. Well, I thought about that for a long time and was wretched for a long time, and I finally said I've made a rash vow and I'm just not going to do that. Bill Hall's coming back from Australia, I think that was the case. He'll contact him. Well, if you won't lead singing, would you come and speak for us? Well, I had to find something to speak, and so I'd been looking at this, and so I spoke 3 times on the Sermon on the Mount. And to make a long story short, that's how the thing started. And somebody else wanted me to speak on it somewhere else. And so I've been thinking about it a good while, and I thought, well, that's the best I can do now. I just started out. I don't know. I didn't know how long it's going to go or what's going to happen to it, but that's how that got done. And then when that was over, what did I do next? I kind of temporized a while by putting in this and that, and I wound up on the parables, I think, the parables of Jesus next. And then I was on Ecclesiastes when the thing shut down. And people have been after me ever since to finish. And I haven't responded too well to that. I haven't done anything about it. Anyway, that's how that...
They start giving you some deadlines.
Right.
Yeah, no, nobody...
Inspire you.
I had to have deadlines. And they had to have significant consequences.
Give us a little insight as to how you prepare. Did you like read the text many times and analyze it and then read other people? And
Well, I did read the text a lot. And of course, I work on 3 chapters in Matthew and a single one in Luke, plus some other material that's in the Gospel of Luke that was spoken at other times but touched on the same subject. But then I read other people. I think John R.W. Stott in his little book, Christian Counterculture, was significant. However, Carl F.H. Henry was a very important thing. I disagreed with him and some of his conclusions. And I read Lloyd Jones and the expositor, but that man can preach on and on one passage of scripture. Remind me of the brother down in Tennessee, or up in Tennessee, who taught the book of Jude for a solid year, which is quite an undertaking. But anyway, that was my approach, and I was on it. You know, I'd already done a lot of the study, done preaching on it, so that helped me. That basic outline was there, my basic approach was there, and it's just a matter of fleshing that out as I went through. And I've told some people that material that I said I was writing on the Sermon on the Mount, but what I was doing, I was just talking about everything I want to talk about, putting it in there. In a measure, I did that. I fleshed it out with ideas and concerns that I had. But anyway, I enjoyed that because I had already run down that road and looked at it pretty carefully. And after that, I had to get to work.
That's the first time I ever heard you, was at Thayer Street.
It was.
I remember that well, and you know, I had never heard of Paul Earnhardt. And he gets up there and said, "What is this? This is the biggest underachiever I have ever met in my life, to preach like that." And so that was when I latched onto it.
Well, I'm the beneficiary of a lot of patient grace on the part of these fellows, because I was scared to death of the obligation to write, and had it not been for them, I dare say I'd never put pen to paper, because it's not my inclination. I'm disinclined that way, but I needed not to be. I've seen the value of the printed page. And so, anyway, they helped me a great deal. And
It's certainly a fact that you can't explain the providence of God. And if you can view it at all, it has to be done retrospectively. But I just tend to believe that this whole union of the editors and the ideas that all came together, including and especially with Paul, were providential.
Yeah. You send us some royalties.
Well, I think I
pay
remember.
handsomely for this.
I think I remember the first meeting we had after we started, we came together and Ed made a comment. Well, Ed, Dee has certainly found his genre and Paul has found his. I don't remember saying anything about you and me, but he was convinced that they both found
I don't even know what that means.
Just keep looking.
Brother Paul, in your last Heartlines column, you discussed the challenge of balancing the tension between knowing as serpents, yet gentle as doves. Could you address yourself to that?
I think that's a challenge all of us have in preaching. First of all, we do respond to what brethren say to us is really helpful. I really enjoyed that lesson. That was tremendous. And we tend to want to repeat that experience, and sometimes we veer in a certain direction because of that. But I had a lot of association with Henry Stone Ficklin up in Kentucky, and he taught me many lessons. And one of those lessons was you can have deep conviction that are really held quite tenaciously, but that mustn't take the love out of it. Because he loved the people who had treated him sometimes abominably. And that struck me. I mean, that had not been a part of my inclination. I was a bit combative, I think, sometimes about things. But you just must always remember what God's purpose was when the gospel was sent into the world, and that's the salvation of the souls of men, that men are not the enemy here. I mean, they can become your enemy, I understand that. But they're the object of God's concern. And so, this matter of balance, so that always you ask yourself the question, how would I want to be addressed on this subject if I have to be the other individual? What would cause me to be more likely to be open to change if that's my purpose? So, and there's a ditch on both sides of the road. And we seem always, we get out of one ditch and we run before no, we're in that ditch on the other side. It's difficult to maintain a balance. And I don't know that any of us maintain it perfectly. And that's the reason that the combination of brethren help to sort of moderate the situation and bring us to see things. You know, I was helped a lot in my association with these fellows, in my approach to things. And what they had developed in themselves, that attitude of character that I myself was lacking in, was very beneficial. Brother Bowman, who talks to everybody. I didn't used to talk to all those common folk, man. But he worked on me so hard, I watched him. I mean, I'm talking to maids, I'm talking to, the garbage collectors, I'm talking to everybody and saying, howdy, how you doing? And of course, Ed takes that as a source of great comedy when he deals with me. But that was very important to me. I don't even touch hem of the garment to Dee's disposition and attitude, but he influenced my attitude toward people. So, preaching needs to have that balance. If you hammer on people, and hammer on people, and hammer on people, I found out that if you hammer on them long enough, they'll say, "You've convinced me that I am not worth warm spit on the griddle, and I am no good, and I'll never be, I can't make it, I give up." But there has got to be a positive thrust in the, and that's where harmless as a dove. You don't want to do anything in your preaching that's going to cause somebody to throw up his hands. You don't want to do that. There must always be in every correction and every admonition the sense that you can do it. You can do it. I'm not trying to repeat the recent slogans of the campaign, but there has to be that approach in preaching that leaves people the sense, that's tough, okay, but by the grace of God, I can do it. And so that's the balance between harmless as a dove and wise as a serpent. I don't think he's going to be like a snake in all ways, but to be subtle and wise.
Shall we stand and sing?
I want to add one thing to that, though, that Paul also brought in, that we're all conscious of. And that is that none of us have ever minimized the importance of being right, being correct, teaching the truth. And, if I don't misperceive, I see some inclination in lots of churches to want nothing but encouragement, and to want nothing but feel good stuff, and that don't know anything about doctrine. Well, that's certainly never been a part of his character or any of the rest of it. One of the things that I have regretted genuinely about what I felt was some of the hyper, unreasonable criticisms that have come out in the last 2 or 3 decades is that they eliminated the voices of people who could have been usefully heard, that need to be heard, calling back to the old past. But what they did was isolate themselves. So our intent was never to diminish in any way that commitment to truth. But it has to be presented, as Paul said, in a way that
the gospel is positive.
it is.
But every positive has an intrinsic negative. Anything that gets in the way of that positive message has got to be rejected and reproved and rebuked, whatever is necessary. But we were misunderstood. I think that we are in an age when, as Ed had said, we don't want to hear a discouraging word. Everything has got to be positive. And I'm not sensitive enough to all that's going on, but there's a tendency to a lot of Reader's Digest homilies. I appreciated what Sewell did Monday evening, last evening, and it's filled with the Scripture, filled with the Word of God. And somebody told me afterwards, said, you preachers need to go back and get some of those sermons out you preached 20, 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
And go over them again. Because we may suffer some things because of the fact that we are not teaching those fundamental lessons that have to do with the approach we make to Scripture. Because we forget that a generation has risen that didn't have our experience. That's a danger. You think, everybody thinks like I do, man, I've got that down. But they don't. And unless they are taught and unless they are engaged with regard to these things, and many times people, as Sewell said, will respond to you in preaching and say, well, that's an interesting approach. I'm glad to hear what you think about that. Because that's as far as it goes. They've got to be engaged at the level of what is right here. What is the truth of God here? And that's going to be a challenge in this age.
Well, and all the while that we were doing the paper, I recall on numerous occasions where we talked about the fact that we were being perceived sometimes as being too positive, and we were fearful that some people would pick up that positive mentality approach and take it too far the other way. we talked about that on numerous occasions, trying to make sure that we didn't leave some kind of an impression that what we were doing and saying was merely a positive thing, that it had a negative to it.
Right.
I remember a lot of discussions with that we were in a good position to pull back some of these men who were moving too far in that
Absolutely.
direction, and that was a source of great concern.
Finally, Brother Paul, can we anticipate the completion of your insights on Ecclesiastes? That we eagerly await.
I'd like to plead the fifth here.
Well, you're in luck because you're out of time.
Okay, good.
I'll let you escape for now.
Next year.
So, it's down to you. A lot of your columns focus on foreign evangelism, people, they're doing the good work of the kingdom overseas. What effect do you feel Christianity Magazine had on foreign evangelism, if any?
I don't really know. I'm not sure to what extent it increased the number of evangelists going. I think it did perhaps enlighten a lot of people of what was being done, and that was one of the reasons I agreed to write a column at the very beginning. I was rather eager for some kind of a forum in which I could enlighten brethren. I found so many brethren just didn't even know that anything was being done in country after country where work was being accomplished, and so I think it enlightened again the common people to things that were going on that they didn't know about, and perhaps has actually contributed to the support of men that were going. And I'd like to hope that some maybe decided to go and work as a result of it. But there certainly was an increased, and people told me over and over when I met them, and got notice from time to time that they were happy to know about individual Christians that were living in different parts of the world, serving the same God and worshiping as the scriptures teach. So there certainly is more consciousness now of those things, and I just rejoice in it. If this made any contribution, I'm thankful for it, but I wouldn't really know how much it contributed.
Did y'all have subscriptions going overseas at all?
We had some, not a lot as I recall, but some. Of course, to many people overseas, we had a few in Europe particularly, but even the subscription cost would be too great for the average Christian in many parts of the world that we were interested in enlightening people about.
What was the story behind your delay of being listed as an editor? You elaborate on that some.
Well, I had created some distrust of papers. Some of the things Ed said a few minutes ago had concerned me. Back in the division of the 50s and 60s, the papers not only provided teaching, but they exercised an influence far beyond anything that they included in their articles. And one or two papers kind of became the center, the focal point of a sectarian division, really. And I wasn't happy with that. And I did not want to become a part of another paper that might foster division and foster sectarianism. And as I said a minute ago, I didn't know Dee. And I had some contact with Brent, but very, very little. And I just didn't know where this paper was going. And so I wanted, as I said, I wanted a forum in which to feature brethren in other parts of the world and that kind of work. And I was happy to write one article each month. But as I met with them, brethren, I think in the very beginning, or after at least the formation of this group, I saw that was not their purpose. And eventually I felt I could join in with a clear conscience and know that's not where this paper is going. And I didn't want to contribute anything to that kind of a paper that would foster division and a sect or a party of some kind.
Well, he was one creative editor once he
that
came
was
to the thing.
Well, I enjoyed very much doing the themes and getting the articles together. It was a pleasure.
If I remember correctly, thought I read in one of the issues that the themes were, it was designed where you could, if you wanted to, remove the staples, pull that theme out, and it could become kind of an evangelistic track. Was there much, did you hear any stories of people using it that way a lot?
I don't know that it was used that much. The first thought was to scatter them through the paper. And I think that may have been my contribution to the makeup of it. I felt that would be a good idea to put it in the center. And that's what was eventually done, but whether it was used that way or not, I really don't know. Don't know that it was.
I've had people tell me that they used them in different ways. I mean, people have used them in classes, and I've certainly had a lot of preachers tell me that they preached them.
Yeah, oh yes, yes. That's been used that way. But as far as the fact that they were together in the center, I'm not sure that had that much to do with it.
Do you have any other questions for Sewell? Okay, we're to the last section. This section, comparison, looking forward. I'm going to have the first three, and then we'll shift to him. What issues? Well, we're kind of already answered this one as I come back to it, so I'm going to skip that first one. When the magazine was ended, the Focus magazine either bought or inherited the subscription list. And what was the history behind how the transition kind of happened behind all that?
We just needed to finish out.
Yeah, we had an issue.
Yeah, I mean, we decided not to continue the paper, that we were going to stop it. And it was just a matter, it was kind of a business matter of, I mean, there was no money exchanged. It was a matter of somebody taking over our...
Not all subscriptions ended at the same time.
Right, so
Yeah.
some people still had subscriptions coming to them by the time we ended, and I think they agreed to complete that with those people in some fashion.
So y'all handed your subscription list over to them? It wasn't a business?
I think so, David. Were you
I
at
think
that's
Focus
right.
at that
I
time?
think that's what happened.
I think that's all there was to it. But we needed our business people here to talk to you about that.
I'm sorry.
Focus fulfilled the obligations of the subscriptions to Christianity Magazine.
I think that's right. And whether we gave Focus some money or not, I don't know.
I think it was quite a bit, actually.
I don't think we did. I think we're recovering from that matter.
Did any of y'all continue writing in any forums on a regular basis?
Not for a paper, I haven't, but of course, I write every day. But they have often solicited, and I'd be glad to do it. I just haven't had time to do it.
There was one issue of Focus magazine that had all editors of Christianity Magazine as the writers of the article of the church.
Right.
Other than that, just occasional articles. Not occasional enough.
I've been happy to contribute to Focus from time to time, and Biblical Insights. I've
Yeah.
had fairly regular articles there. I appreciate the opportunity to say some things occasionally.
I suppose that probably the reason we don't write more than we do is because there are no longer any deadlines, and so there's no inspiration.
This first issue of Christianity Magazine does not refer anywhere to www.anything, and there's a reason for that. I don't think it was available then. But the last issue doesn't either. But now we're faced with www everything, and so would you speak to what you think is different now and the challenges that are faced by publications such as Biblical Insights and Focus? Any advice that you would give? Or
Oh, the old school, I still like something holding my hand. But I know that the wind is blowing the other way.
All the media are suffering. I mean, newspapers are in dire straits financially. They're getting so small that, about this way. And
Print's getting smaller too.
print, yeah. So that is a fact. Now, how that's going to affect journalism for Christians who are trying to produce spiritual articles. I'm not sure, but a lot of people don't read that much. Well, they get on,
That's the problem.
you know, they're getting on these new technologies.
There are 2 or 3 things that bother me about the internet. One of them is just purely journalistic, I guess. The language is being crucified by the internet, just a little at a time. Abbreviations are just absolutely offensive to me, and they're over and over and over again. It's almost as if there's a new language being done. The other thing that bothers me considerably about it, and I haven't looked at a lot, but I have people send me things from time to time. It bothers me that it's so easy to use, that people vent their wrath and vent their ungodly attitudes without any hesitation at all. And so when they couple that with bad language, it turns me pretty sourly quickly. And I'm not opposed to the internet nor the use of it. I'm just opposed to the way it's being used in its present form.
You like it better than PowerPoint? Just for a historical perspective, I would tell you more than the internet, that where papers are, it seems to me today, and to some extent this institution, is in a period when people in churches no longer feel the need for that kind of thing in the way that we did back in the 50s and 60s, when people felt under duress and to be tied to other people and to know that they had brethren. So many people today are, as I said before, are in good churches. They have their own publications that are good. Their class material is good. They go to Auburn to school where there are 100 Christian kids in the local church, or to Tuscaloosa or some other place. So that institutions and magazines just don't feel the same kind of need that they did back in the days when the Gospel Guardian was around, or even when we were around.
But that fits just a little bit with what I said a minute ago. That it was in those isolated churches that didn't have a good Bible teaching program, maybe even didn't even have a local preacher, that I think our paper was most appreciated.
It was. And I think we still need to sell them. I mean, it comes up every time, the question of whether we should send Focus or anything to our biblical insights to the people in the congregation. My answer always is, hey, they're reading all kind of other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a bad idea to have something that would probably be useful for them there to read.
I don't have any others in that section.
No.
There's one from the historical section we missed out on that I'm going to ask with some caution, because I might have my facts wrong. It's really just trying to be curious about what exactly happened. The first issues of the magazine, to my knowledge, did not have a local church information section in the back. And then it began, and I was just wondering when and why did that feature start, and how the congregations got on the list. Now the last part of the question, I guess the most touchy part, is, was it intentional? From what I can tell on most of the lists that I looked at, was it intentional to leave off Church of Christ as you listed the congregations? They were just listed as the such and such Golden Church, for example.
Those decisions, number one, were made when we all satisfied our conscience that it was all right to do it, that we were not doing something that was dishonest or disreputable, that it was something that had a vaguely justifiable reason. And beyond that, I mean, the main thing, I guess, was money. That is, we're always in a struggle to find ways to raise revenue. But we had to do that with the beginning of saying we think there is a legitimate purpose that is to be gained by a congregation running this ad, that they will get something out of it. Yeah, there probably was some discussion about the listing, I don't know, but there probably was. And
I just don't remember.
I don't
remember
either.
that. I remember
we
the,
tried to get just the information that was necessary and essential so that we
Yeah.
could put it in
I remember the money angle because I think there was one year that we actually made money, and if I recall, it was something like $7.87.
You actually had a year in the black?
I think
Yeah,
we did,
I
one
think we
year.
probably did. That was probably the year when we didn't get to play golf.
Motel, at Motel 6 and, what was that other place?
But that issue probably was discussed.
I can remember we were a little reluctant to start it.
Yes, we
I
were.
recall.
We were.
Yeah, we all were.
We wanted to stay with biblical material and not do that, but I think it was financial.
It was.
I thought that we
Mostly, I think.
could make a contribution to churches to let them know about, let others know about them, so.
Well, you are five men who know and love Jesus, and I speak for a lot of other people that we have watched and benefited from your knowledge and love, and that you've helped other people know and love Jesus through this paper in a lot of other ways. If you want to, would you take a couple of minutes and just give us some final reflections on your part in the paper, what you think the paper has done, the goals you had for it. You want to start?
No. I've said about all I know to say on the subject. I'm glad we did it. I believe, as Ed said a few moments ago, that it served a good purpose at a very good time. And we're thankful for whatever good it did, and regretful of any harm that was caused. But the harm was certainly unintentional, and the good was very much intentional as we sought to glorify God.
When I reflect on the numbers of times that people commented to me about this paper and what it meant to them over the years that we did it, and heard reports from these other men as to what they were hearing, I had no question but what we were doing good with it. And that's a wonderful thing to think about at this point.
There are lots of things that I think I could say about my association with the paper personally. Brother Earnhardt mentioned having learned some things. I learned a lot from these men about how to conduct yourself in the middle of difficult situations and controversies. And I wouldn't take anything for having learned that. But I learned more than that from these men, what it means to love the Lord and His truth. Because as I pointed out earlier, I never saw a time when I thought any one of the five was out of order in the feelings that he had about what needed to be done and the motive for which we were doing them. I thought it was always of the highest sort. And I must tell you that there could not be four fellows that I have a higher regard for or more love for than I do them, even when Ed does me like he does.
You learn to forgive him, haven't you?
That's right. I've learned to forgive Ed.
Well, we had a lot of fun. I enjoyed that. Our times together were really classic, and our families knitted together. And, so that personal side of it was really a great plus for us. And it was a selfish endeavor. I mean, as far as I know, nobody had any selfish motives. I don't think anybody was looking for career advancement or anything else. We pretty much stuck with what we were trying to do. As a historian, I would say that when I look back, I think Christianity Magazine did fulfill a fairly significant function in this 17-year period in non-institutional churches, and kind of giving a certain cohesion to what could have been, it could have been a some right kind of movement. It could have become an extremely narrow-based, factional movement. It has not become that. I believe non-institutional churches of Christ will, in another 25 years, be the largest segment of churches of Christ. I don't know how many of you read Christian Chronicle about the diminishing demographics in churches of Christ. The churches of Christ are actually shrinking at a remarkable rate. What that actually doesn't show is that the single group within that larger category that is growing pretty rapidly are non-institutional churches. So I think that just definitionally it'll be looked upon as a kind of a centrist expression in those days that could have been quite factious. Now, we're kind of through that period now. We're probably about to get into a new period of a different kind of factionalism.
I think it was a good endeavor. We still have people that tell us we miss the magazine.
Yeah.
One rather remarkable thing is, in papers, we know all the stories about editors getting crosswise and men that once were working together, suddenly they're at odds with each other. I cannot think of a single occasion when we ever had the least bit of that among us. We had discussions openly and agreed, disagreed about things, but none of it ever caused any kind of separation and I think it was because none of us had any ambition for ourselves in it. So we weren't struggling with each other to see who could be on the top rung. And we did do a whole lot to encourage one another. And we had times when that happened. Now, Ed was a little rough on me down in Jacksonville. And his sister Marilyn got after him about it, taking advantage of Brother Paul, like he did. But, I mean, a lot of good humor.
Oh, you pitiful thing.
Don't ever get into a word combat with Brother Harold. He will always win.
Sure enough.
He will. I think I only got him one time, a little bit, when I said that his preaching style was so infectious that at times it made me want to brush the hair.
If you just had some.
And he would not let that stand.
Oh, okay.
And so the next service, when he was speaking, he came back with his hair slicked down, I'm talking about, with some greasy solution. And that was his answer. But anyway, that was one of the, that's all I can think about. If you got into any discussion, it was over. He was going to have the last word.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your love for God. Thank you for your time that you spent editing this magazine. And thanks for the afternoon.
It was a pleasure.
All that you have done to make it possible.
Yeah, and thanks for the digitalizing and all that you did.
And thanks to you guys who are still trying to do it.
Absolutely.